There are many, many things that I love about horror scholarship and specifically monster studies. It's what I specialize in, it's what I wrote my dissertation on, but among the many cool things about this area is how much of it is freely available online. I'm Carlos, I'm an educator and a literary scholar. Here are 6 pieces of monster theory that you can access right now with nothing but an internet connection. I think lots of monster theorists and horror scholars would be comfortable saying that one of the fundamental essays of the field is H.P. Lovecraft's 1925 to 27 essay Supernatural Horror in Literature. He wrote it in that time period. He came out with it in 27 and then he expanded it again and revised it to be republished in 1933-34, something thereabouts. And in this essay, he takes the time to make a sort of history. I wouldn't go so far as to say a taxonomy of, but certainly a history of the horror genre and sort of his articulation of what the weird tale is. We get that expression from H.P. Lovecraft, the weird tale. He at least popularized it and kind of became the sort of godfather to the weird. There were weird writers before him, and this essay is what makes that case. He starts way, way, way back. It's talking about myths and talking about, we get that very famous line that the greatest emotion of mankind is fear, and the greatest fear is fear of the unknown. That comes from this essay. And he starts off there in a sort of faux anthropological stance to talk about how we used to be afraid of things, and we gave those things that we didn't understand names, and those names eventually became monsters. It's important to note H.P. Lovecraft himself was an atheist. He also wasn't a very good dude. So H.P. Lovecraft sort of talks about his own literary genealogy and who he read to get to a point where he started to write horror, and sort of his circle, because the Cthulhu mythos started with him, but it expanded beyond him. It even lived on beyond him and continues to be expanded on today by other filmmakers and other writers who build on that mythos that started with H.P. Lovecraft, his articulation of what makes the weird and what makes the horror tale a proper, artful, skillful horror tale. You can find it in Supernatural Horror in Literature. There is an annotated critical version by H.P. Lovecraft scholar S.T. Joshi. If you want to have a deeper dive into it, I definitely suggest picking that up. It's slim and it's really valuable, but you don't need it. You also can just read the essay and get a lot out of it. The second piece of horror scholarship that you can find for free right now is an essay by J.R.R. Tolkien, called Beowulf, the Monster, and the Critics. He wrote it in 1936. I think most people know that he was a writer, right, of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and he was certainly a linguist and a philologist too in the cultural imagination. Especially, we all know that he made up all these languages, Elvish, and for example, made his own translation from the Old English of Beowulf. At the time of the writing of this essay, J.R.R. Tolkien's feelings about Beowulf being a strong piece of art with a lot of lessons to teach us about personhood and about society, that's not how the rest of academia treated this poem. For most in academia at the time, Beowulf was little more than an interesting historical artifact. It gave us some info about, I guess, Anglo-Saxon society at the time, and maybe some of the linguistic artifacts that it carries. Most people did not treat it as a proper piece of art. It was a quirk at worst, and at best, it was a historical artifact. J.R.R. Tolkien took the poem and made the case for it being an important piece of art, an important poem. He also specifically made the case that this is because of the monster figures in the poem. So Grendel's mother, the dragon at the end of the poem, these aren't just silly fantastical add-ons to like appease the masses. These were important figures, important hermeneutics to understand what was going on at the time, sure, but also important aesthetic elements of the poem. It is because of J.R.R. Tolkien's essay that we can treat Beowulf and a lot of other pre-modern poetry as exactly that, as poetry. And we don't dismiss it, and we certainly don't dismiss it because of the figure of the monster. In fact, we treasure it all the more because of what it has to say about who is and is not a person, what kind of bodies are and are not rendered monstrous. Jumping ahead 50 years, another pretty important essay is by Carol J. Clover. It's called Her Body, Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film. So this essay eventually would become Men, Women, and Chainsaws. That was published 5 years later, I think, in 1992. It's where we get the figure of the final girl. And that started with this essay where she sort of talks about how you would think that male audiences watching slasher films, because of their gender, would want to see through the eyes of the almost exclusively male villain. But it turns out that so many of them cheer for, more importantly, identified with the female protagonist. That tension between their own masculine gender and identifying with the masculinity of the villain versus the feminine gender of the final girl and rooting for her and seeing through her eyes, that tension was something that she was able to articulate into what we call the final girl now. It's a super interesting piece. Google it and it comes right up. One of the more fundamental, and for a lot of people, a lot including myself actually, their first instance of monster scholarship that they read that opens the field up for them is Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's 1996 essay, Monster Culture, 7 Theses. So it's what it sounds like. He sort of takes the idea of like, okay, what actually is the monster? Jeffrey Jerome Cohen is a medievalist primarily. Other things that he's written has been, for example, an edited collection on animal, plant, mineral. He's also written a book on giants, and his main work has to do with pre-modern medieval literature. In monster culture, he allows for 7 arguments, and they are arguments, theses, as to what the monster is. And each argument is a section of the essay where he tries to articulate through examples how a monster can serve as a hermeneutic for understanding culture. Basically, monsters reflect and change with, and in turn change the societies out of which they arise. They're contingent on what people fear, and so they can be used as a way to read culture. That is sort of the jumping off point for most, if not all, monster theory being done today. It's a hugely, hugely important essay, anthologized and referenced in any treatment of the monster today. Certainly it had a place in my dissertation, and I suggest you go take a look. Then 6-ish years later, China Miéville, the author of like The City in the City and Embassy Town, he is, first of all, a genius, second of all, a madman. And he wrote an essay called On Monsters, or 9 or More Monstrous Not Cannies. I'm going to warn you, this is not a super accessible essay. He really leans into the playfulness and the frustration of language and of the monster as a linguistic and literary figure. So for those of you who know your Freud, the uncanny, the unheimlich, is that which is sort of like but not quite. You recognize it, but something is off and you're not sure how. And there have been lots of attempts to describe the monster in terms of the uncanny. What Miéville does is takes a step back and say, well, how about other kinds of not canny, not just uncanny, but abcanny. And he plays around with different kinds of cannies. It is fun to watch him work, and it is freeing to know what you can do with language when you treat the monster with respect and also playfulness. This essay is one that maybe you'll have to reread, and that's okay. It's really good. You should definitely go take a look at it. The last one, the piece itself is not a work of scholarship, but it became a piece of scholarship that I really admire. Amanda LeDuc in 2018 wrote an article called On Fairy Tales. She is a writer of and scholar of disability in literature, specifically in the fairy tale. In this article, she talks about her experience of disability ever since childhood through the lens of the body of the mermaid, specifically the body of the mermaid, and how that helped her understand her own body and her own illness, and more importantly, her own difference from people who were treated as not sick, people who were treated as normal, not disabled. That eventually becomes her 2020 title, Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. It's a really lovely little book, and I think you should go pick it up. But the sort of seed for that book, you can see it already in this article that you can pull up right now and read. It's really very interesting, and I love seeing people like Leduc using stories and narrative, specifically weird stories, weird narrative, in a sort of live auto construction. It's really, really interesting and really challenging, and I love to see it. So those were 6 titles that with a Google search you'll be able to read right now. Let me know if you look at any of them, what you think of them in the comments. I'll see you next time.